Hi everyone, this is Geoff Chrysler of Right Way Heritage Trimming and a detail enthusiast. It's been about 26 months since I started the restoration of my Austin Healey 100, and in that time I've made some very good progress. I thought I would post a general recap video showing before and after pics of what's been done so far. I will post more videos as the project moves along and more things get finished. So, to start off, here is my BN1 as I purchased it from the Beverly Hills Car Club in Los Angeles in September 2018. In spite of it being resprayed red at some point, the inner chassis still had its original Healey blue shining through, including some of her original blue trim in the rear cockpit and boot. As I began disassembling the car, I was careful to take thousands of pics to properly document everything as I took it all apart, bagging and tagging every piece, and making notes and lists about broken or missing hardware that I encountered along the way. Fortunately, I found clear evidence that the shrouds had never been off the car, and under the patina of respray red, the car was mostly original inside. Here's some of the original Healey blue in daylight. Also note the original hand-brushed factory undercoating over the rear axle and under the boot floor. Speaking of paint, I was contacted by my late father's good friend and longtime painter, Ron Allman. Ron had painted all the dozens of Healeys Dad restored over the decades, and still had enough of my dad's custom mix of Healey blue that they had come up with and researched to get right decades ago. It has a much finer metallic flake in it than is even available in most of today's paints. I had some sprayed out and compared it to a sample my painter had originally come up with, and I think it matches even better. Here's Dad's mix on the left, my painter's choice in the middle, and some original paint from my car on the right. Once apart, the chassis and body was delivered to Jetstream Auto and Custom to be media blasted to bare metal and have all the metal and paint done properly. All new sills from Kilmartin were installed on both sides, and lower repair sections were added to all the door posts and lower fenders. We replaced the front cross member with a new and reinforced one from Kilmartin. The right side engine mount showed signs that it had been removed and crudely replaced at some point in the car's life, so we decided to redo this repair by removing it and the plate someone had added to the bottom, and then extending the bottom to the correct length and welding it back in properly. The inner footwells along the firewall had also been hacked open and screwed back together, probably to make room for a bigger engine at some point, so we closed them up again properly too. A few minor repair sections and lots of hammer and dolly work was needed to smooth out all the dents in the fenders, but they were otherwise in fairly good shape. In the boot, we replaced the left and right frame members and patched some areas in the floor. I chose to hand strip all of the aluminum body panels myself, including the front and rear shrouds, dash, and valance, and the bonnet and boot lids, which on this car were early enough to still be made of aluminum. With the body all repaired and fitted up, we got into the filling stage. Jason from Jetstream showed me the basics, and I proceeded to do much of the filling and sanding required to level out the body panels. Then came a coat of filler primer, which was again block sanded out smooth. Here we are fitting the grille in its bare brass state so we can adjust and tweak it to be a perfect fit before finally re-chroming it. Meanwhile, the original two-piece dash, which had been painted over with red and silver, clearly showed the original Healey blue paint still underneath the gauge cluster, with dark blue showing through under the red on the main section. I stripped the dash by hand and had Jetstream take care of the prep and paint. I cleaned up the gauges and hardware as best I could, but I opted to send the gauges out for rebuild and calibration by Nissinger's in New York. Nissinger's did a beautiful job restoring them, and they even replaced the face on the tachometer so it better matched the patina of the others. Jetstream did a brilliant job painting the body and gauge cluster in the contrasting blues, even using a reddish primer on the backside like the factory did. I reassembled all the pieces temporarily, and voila, the finished dashboard. Next, I completely rebuilt, flushed out, and tested the original heater, including the rheostat switch. I repainted the body in black wrinkle finish as original, with semi-gloss black on all the internal pieces. I replaced the missing switch knob and finished it off with a new Smith's logo on the front. I thoroughly cleaned, rebuilt, and tested the original wiper motor, also date-coded for 53, taking care to re-grease all the internal mechanism and repainting the body in black wrinkle finish as original. Throughout the restoration process, I bead blast and replate all of the steel hardware in their respective finishes, like zinc. Here is my Eastwood home zinc plating system in action. While this is great when rebuilding a separate component like the heater, I still had most of the car's general hardware plating done by Electroshine Plating in Sydney, BC. Much of the mechanical and suspension hardware was originally finished in black phosphate. For this process, I use a gun bluing acid which turns the freshly cleaned steel pieces black and then is finished off by soaking and baking the parts in grease. Wire clips were refinished in yellow zinc as original. I also had Electroshine do all of my re-chroming for the car. Here are my pair of re-chromed factory original bumpers that I procured from Kurt Arndt. Of course, much of the smaller parts were a simple case of cleaning and polishing or painting by hand, like the original starter solenoid, the dip switch, the fresh air vents and pedals, the signal relay box, dated for 53, thoroughly cleaned and refinished in polished zinc. I thoroughly cleaned the voltage regulator and polished the Bakelite body and finished it off with the correct factory warning tag. The original fuse block polished up nicely. The original overdrive relays and flasher unit, all polished and carefully hand-painted to look like zinc. Then I hand-scribed the original lettering back on the flasher unit with an artist's pen. The original battery switch cleaned up and still works beautifully. Speaking of batteries, I was able to source a pair of the new Lucas 6-volt batteries from Antique Battery, as well as a new pair of trays from Kilmartin and a set of the correct hardware made by Mike Salter. I purchased a new cloth wiring harness from British Wiring and correctly wrapped the chassis and overdrive sections in black plastic tape as original. I sourced some original horns through my friend Richard Korn and proceeded to test and restore them with some new outer body rings, repaired mounting brackets, and color-matched paint. Headlight assemblies were rebuilt with new rubbers, and I found some original Lucas 700 headlamps, which were standard on all Canadian exports. I also sourced some new old stock Lucas 488 signal and brake lights. I rebuilt and refinished the brake master cylinder and reservoir with a rebuild kit and a new decal purchased through Moss Motors. I cleaned and repainted the original coil from 53 after having it tested by Brian Roberts Electric, then finished it with a new correct style Lucas decal that I found through Holden Electrics in the UK. I sourced some of the correct early adjustable steering arms from Kent Lambert and cleaned them up with new dust covers and grease nipples. I cleaned and rebuilt the original steering box and idler assemblies with new oil seals and dust covers. The front and rear shocks were sent for a rebuild with new seals by Apple Hydraulics in New York. Then I finished them in satin black paint as original. I completely rebuilt the front suspension by first documenting, cleaning, bead blasting, and refinishing all of the components in their respective finishes. Then I purchased new kingpin kits and installed them into the swivel axles with new bushings pressed in and reamed to size with new spacers and seals. Luckily, I was able to borrow my good friend Trevor's kingpin bushing reamer tool, which is essential for this process. I also purchased new splined hubs with new studs that had to be tightened into the hubs and peened over on the backsides to prevent them from moving. Then I assembled the hubs to the stub axles with new seals and bearings packed with fresh grease and held in place with a big nut and cotter pin, and finally the grease cup. I had the brake shoes all relined by Senco Brakes in Surrey, BC, and then offered them up to the new brake cylinders and springs. Then I fit the freshly turned brake drums and finished them off by installing new brake lines and bleed screws to the back plates. As for the rear axle, I started off by carefully disassembling and documenting the spiral bevel axle and brake assemblies. The left hub showed evidence of some heavy trauma. There were cracks found in the drum and the inner hub around the lug nuts. This meant I had to source an early replacement brake drum and a new inner hub. The brake back plate also showed signs of being dragged, as if the wheel must have come off at some point. Once again, Jetstream did a great job of repairing the slice. I thoroughly cleaned and inspected the rest of the axle. I replaced the pinion seal, axle seals, and gaskets, as well as the bearings, axle nuts, and a new inner left hub to replace the cracked one. After thoroughly cleaning the body to bare steel and aluminum, I gave the body a coat of gloss black POR 15 rust proofing that gives a very strong and chip-resistant layer of protection. Then I followed with finishing it in a satin black paint. I reassembled the back plates, followed by the inner hubs and axle shafts. I then installed all new brake lines and assembled the emergency brake rods with new bushings and white felt spacers in all the links. After carefully inspecting the wheel cylinders for any scratches or corrosion, I found I was able to rebuild the original rear brake cylinders and adjusters with rebuild kits. I assembled the cylinders with some Sil-Glide brake grease that is safe and compatible with rubber parts and brake fluids. I installed the rebuilt cylinders and adjusters to the back plates and connected the new brake lines and emergency levers. I had the drums all turned at a machine shop, and then I gave them a fresh coat of matching silver wheel paint. I finished the rear brake assemblies with new splined hubs and knockoffs ready for the wire wheels. As for the wheels, I procured a new set of 48-spoke wire wheels and new Michelin X tires through my friend Harry Watson. After cleaning them as best I could, I delivered the gas tank and the original radiator to Townside Automotive to be properly boiled and flushed out in their hot tank and then pressure tested. I finished them off with a fresh coat of semi-gloss black paint and a new rad cap. After sourcing the correct size of radiator hose from Napa, I decided to recreate the wrapped look of factory hoses by wrapping them with a thin material soaked in rubber cement. I still need to make a stamp for the number. For the carburetors, I completely rebuilt and polished the original H4 carbs with new SU major rebuild kits. I then sourced some original Burgess air filters and restored them in satin black finish with new Burgess tags. The original carburetor linkage polished up beautifully. I began the engine rebuild back in the fall of 2019, and what I discovered as I dismantled everything was a tired engine that had clearly been rebuilt in the past, with bigger and mismatched pistons, replacement bucket-style cam lifters and push rods, and a significantly lighter flywheel. I delivered the components to Mid-Island Machine to have the block re-sleeved and everything remachined true again. I replaced all the pistons, valves, and guides as well. Then I carefully rebuilt the engine with all new gaskets, including a new performance steel head gasket, front timing cover seal, and a new set of head studs. I rebuilt the rocker shaft, replaced the water pump, and rebuilt the engine mounts with new rubber blocks. Then I painted and detailed the engine with the correct dust green paint I sourced from Moss Motors. I rebuilt and replaced much of the Purelator oil filter assembly with the correct parts which had been missing on my car. I also rebuilt the distributor with fresh points, rotor, and condenser, and sourced an original set of Champion NA8 spark plugs with the proper molded rubber boots. I had the generator and starter both professionally rebuilt and tested by Brian Roberts Electric here in Victoria. I then painted and detailed them before temporarily fitting them with the engine. I decided to give the 3-speed gearbox rebuild to our local expert here, Tom Monroe. Unfortunately though, we found I needed to replace all the gears and several other bearings and components from a donor gearbox that I purchased. Tom rebuilt and even tested the function of it all, so in the end I have a smooth functioning gearbox and overdrive unit that works and doesn't leak. Yet. With the car's interior, I was able to find a perfect match for the original interior Vianide and various other factory materials. I then proceeded to produce a complete set of new interior components using the correct patterns for early BN1 specifications. I made myself a finished pair of the stock pleated leather seats, and then also made myself a 100S style driver's seat just in case I want to swap it in for long trips. I made a new early style tonneau cover with the correct lightning zipper and all original 10X snap hardware, and a new set of side screens fully restored with my original frames and chrome hardware. I also made a full new set of stowage bags for the boot, and even sourced a complete and fully restored factory toolkit through Heeley tool specialist Kurt Arndt, while Mike Salter provided the new jack handles. Last but not least, I've collected all the factory owner's literature, including the owner's handbook, workshop manual, parts catalog, factory brochures, the special tuning manual, the overdrive handbook, the grease gun instructions, and an Austin factory warranty. So that's where I'm at in my restoration so far. We're now closing in on December 2020. The parts are all neatly organized and ready to assemble to the car. The body is almost finished being fettled as we're getting the bonnet and boot lid fit corrected and perfected. As soon as that's done, we'll take the body panels all apart again and paint the inner chassis and inner body panels in the Heeley blue. Then I'll have lots of assembly work to do assembling the running rolling chassis before finally refitting the body for final paint and finishing. I'll be back with more videos to show you my progress. Until next time, I'm Geoff Chrysler. Bye for now.